Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. A'udhu billahi minash shaitani rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Mohammed Ngubong. We've now come to another podcast where we talk about certain values and certain concepts of Islam. Today, inshallah, we're going to talk about a topic which seems to have gathered some interest, and that is that Islam is against all forms of slavery. Islam is against all forms of slavery. Now, you might be surprised that we are right in the middle. Today is the 1st of December 2023. And we are talking about slavery when perhaps you think slavery was over in the 18th century. When you hear of slavery, most people think of chains, whips, and forced labor, as used to happen in certain plantations, with the Europeans who took millions of Africans to go and work in plantations in Europe, or the Arabs who took many Africans to go and serve them in Arabia during the Arab slave trade. But there are many forms of slavery, some of which you might not recognize as slavery. And when you do not recognize that as slavery, it makes you to be the ideal slave. Who is the ideal slave? The ideal slave is a person who doesn't know that he or she is a slave. Better still, for the slave master, things can be even better, because the slave might actually strive to be a very obedient slave, thinking that that is a virtue to acquire, depending on the level of brainwashing which the particular society has given that person. What does the slave paradigm depend on? What are the conditions which usually bring slavery into society? In this world, our experience of life basically has two paths, two different roads to take in our experience. A, service to others, and B, service to self. Those who enslave others or consent to be enslaved are usually on the service to self path. In order to understand the fundamental difference between these two paths, which could be paths which you can take to success, you can actually go on service to self. As long as you serve yourself without wronging anyone else, you can go forward. Now, in order to give a good overview of what these two paths are, let us consider a dream. When you see in a dream, for example, a lot of other people in the dream doing whatever, there are two ways to look at it. The first way, that is the path of service to self, is to say that this is my dream. And all those holograms or people who are there in the dream are there for me to try and manipulate in order to satisfy myself, because it is my dream. And the more I can manipulate them to reduce them into slavery, the better it will be for me. That is a service to self. The person who is on service to others will see the thing differently. He will say, well, I'm in this dream and there are many other people in the dream. Anything I do to another person, I shouldn't do anything to another person which I wouldn't want someone to do to me, because that other person is just as valid a person as I am. In other words, whatever I do to someone else, I'm also doing to myself. Now, so those who are on service to self consider themselves to progress when they polarize negatively. In other words, when they succeed in enslaving other people, they become negatively polarized and they have more power over those people. And those who are of service to others become positively polarized when they serve a large number of people. Obviously, Shaitan, who is a clear symbol of service to self, is on the service to self path. How can you detect the service to self path, or we'll call that, from that on we'll call that the negative path? How can you detect the negative path of service to self from the positive path of service to others? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives one very good rule. In Surah Baqarah, verse 268, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, الشيطان يعدكم الفقر ويأمركم بالفحشاء والله يعدكم المغفرة منه وفضله والله واسع عليم. Shaitan threatens you with the prospect of lack, of poverty, of diminishing of self or things. And because of that, he beats you to be niggardly and to do abominous things. While Allah promises you forgiveness and abundance, bounty. Allah is of infinite knowledge. You see. So, those of service to self, in order to make you to consent to be enslaved, why is your consent required? Because there are some things called universal laws, which even the person of service to self has to follow. And one of these universal laws is the law of free will. If he makes you into a slave without your consent, then there will be a return on him. That is the law which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put it. That is why even those who are enslaving mankind always somehow manage to make us have the message of what they want to do before they do it. And there are many examples I can give you. This thing which people were injecting into themselves, you know what I'm talking about. In 1981, Dean Koontz wrote a book where he said a certain epidemic will spread from a Chinese town called Wuhan, which will kill by respiratory insufficiency. 1981. So can anybody say they didn't tell us? And there are many other things like that. So, before going on, let us see what are these universal laws, which both the service to self or the negative path and the service to others will have to follow if they are to avoid a reaction on things which they do. I'm going to list about 7 of them. The first one is the law of intention and attention. You as a Caliph of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on earth, when you formulate an intention to do something, then the vibration of your spiritual body sends out a vibration into the universal ether, which makes the ether immediately to start reacting to that particular intention. Now, if that intention is followed by your attention, meaning focusing your attention on that particular thing, then that thing continues to be built until it could come into manifestation. So that has been used by those who've been trying to enslave us to make things to their liking, while at the same time making us think that we are very powerless and we can do nothing. We accepted it. We gave our consent, and we, for most cases, handed over our power to them. The second law is the law of attraction. What you do to others comes to you. That's one aspect of it. Second aspect of it is the vibration you maintain attracts the same vibration to you. In other words, if all the time you're complaining about poverty, then always around you will surround poverty. You're attracting poverty to yourself. The third aspect of it is when you think a particular thought which is in a particular category, then if you keep thinking that thought, the law of attraction will make other thoughts similar to that of the same family, so to speak, to come and crowd your mind. You see, it has many aspects. It can be seen as something which symbolizes justice. You do something to others, it is done to you. It can also enable us to better control our lives, to bring about things in a way which favors us. The third universal law is the law of patience. In other words, us in the third density, we cannot yet manifest something instantly. So when we have an intention followed by attraction, then we must maintain that for a long enough time with that particular thing while being patient. And remember, the patience is not an easy thing to do, because while you are patient, you have to be patient while bearing the opposite of what you're wanting to come, without losing hope and maintaining faith. Then the fourth rule is the law of balance. The thing which you want can never come exactly the way you want, because you're not living alone in the world. It will always come in such a way as to also allow others to live. That is the law of balance. The fifth one is the law of free will. You don't have a right to do anything on any person without his consent. If you do that, you violated free will. And it's a very important law. The sixth one is the law of evolution. It is the right of every sentient being in the universe to evolve, that is, to go forward in terms of knowledge, wisdom, health, experience, joy, abundance, and so on. Anybody who tries to prevent any creature of Allah from progressing has violated the law of evolution. And the seventh law is the law of love. We are basically here in the world to learn how to love. Eventually, if we succeed, we end up with unconditional love. Now, the bad guys who are going to service to serve have gone as far as even trying to modify us genetically so as to make us incapable of pursuing our path and progressing. They discovered a certain gene called UMAT2, which seems to facilitate the enslavement of people and enable the person not to realize the power within himself, but to give that power outside to someone else. So they've always been manipulating to try and activate that gene in order to control the earth. And unfortunately for them, the people who are fighting to help humanity have pretty much removed all the gadgets and equipment, which were somewhere in the orbit of Saturn, others were on the moon, which they were using to maintain this gene in activity. That is why you find people liberating themselves everywhere, including even Africa. They also manipulated with our consent to lower our lifespan. You can see examples of that with the story, the legend of the Tower of Babel, which is mentioned in the Christian Bible. Obviously, you shouldn't believe that anybody would build a tower and go and meet God in the sky. It's totally ridiculous. Nevertheless, that story has some foundation. You see, if you look at the works of Zachariah Sitchin, who interpreted the Sumerian texts, he illustrated that the word used for tower in the Sumerian text was actually Shem, and Shem is a sky-going vehicle. In other words, some of our ancestors were advanced enough to try to build sky-going vehicles in order to rival certain people who have come from outside and were trying to dominate them. And in order to, at the time, our ancestors used to live for more than 1,000 years. In order to dominate them, they now decided to manipulate with their genes and put telomere caps on the chromosome, which usually makes aging to get initiated. That an idea of such a thing having been done can be seen when you look at the biblical passage that the days of man shall now be limited to 120 years. I think it's Harvard or Yale University. They performed a study which indicated that if human beings on earth can get rid of all the toxins and so on we're being fed, then he can have an average lifespan of about 120 years. But we have religious texts which are indicating to us that some of our parents, like Nuhu and so on, used to live for over 1,000 years. That was before they manipulated with our DNA. And those who manipulated with our DNA, they were doing it for reasons of service to self, like we've always been mentioning. Now, so you can see how insidious, how evil those who are following the service to self path are. And those who are following the service to others, basically, they consider all of us as one. In other words, if you do anything to anybody, you are doing it to yourself. And so slavery is basically perpetrated by those who are following the service to self-path. Why is free will important? We see in this passage where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the salvation of man in Surah An-Naba, verse 39. That is Surah 78, verse 39. He says, ذَلِكَ لِيَوْمُ الْحَقِّ فَمَنْ شَاءَ اتَّخَذَ إِلَى رَبِّهِ مَآبًا. This day where we're going to have our issue settled is a certain thing to come. So whoever wishes, let him take refuge. Whoever wishes, let him take refuge with his Lord. Whoever wishes. In other words, even the salvation of mankind is not being imposed on mankind by the Creator. You have your free will. You must do it of your own free will. He says in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 256, La ikraha fi din. There is no compulsion in religion. Any good deed which you do has no value if you are forced to do it. It has to be done by your own free will. Humans were created free. They were free to be self-sufficient, free to be self-determined, free to be individuals who can contribute their gifts to society and the universe. They have the freedom to express themselves, that is freedom of speech, freedom to exert social power and change the structure of their society, freedom of religion, freedom to think, act, move around, discern one's inner direction and pursue that direction, freedom to create, discover one's greater purpose and express that purpose without oppression, condemnation and subjugation. In order to deny freedom, one has the following imposed on oneself. Those of service to self, to deny our freedom, they usually impose fear, guilt, unworthiness, class separation, hierarchy of power. In other words, these things are things which tell you you're not free, obey. And usually those who are serving to self, they're very good on the word obey. Instead of empowering you and giving you freedom, they want you to obey some authority. That is taking away your power from you. I can understand why there is so much interest on this particular topic. Because if people were to gain their freedom, a lot of undue slavery and domination of some by others will instantly come to an end. The opposite of freedom, of course, is slavery. And we have different types of slavery in the world. Let us begin with physical slavery. Physical slavery, and that should include chemical and biological slavery, is slavery which is used to compel people to act and do certain things. In the case of physical slavery, people are forced physically to act in a certain way, either by working with little or no pay, without having any choice in the matter. That is slavery. You catch somebody either directly or indirectly by manipulation, like accusing him of some false crimes which he did not do, so that he has, in order to free himself from this false accusation, he has to accept to work in slavery. Or like the international pharmaceutical mafia has pretty much caught people into chemical slavery. You have diseases, they give you drugs which only relieves the symptoms and gives many side effects. The side effects cause other illnesses which you need other medicines to solve, and you spend all your time working just to get that money and take and hand over to the international pharmaceutical mafia. They are real slave masters. You don't see the chains on you, but they are well and truly there through the diseases which you're forced to go to them for. And they've made sure that all other methods of treatment which can jeopardize their control are stifled, and they don't hesitate to even go as far as to kill people, like Dr. Sebi. Now, that is chemical and biological slavery, which I've classified together with physical slavery. And you will see that that is well and truly on today. The second type of slavery we can consider is economic and financial slavery, where you have a financial system which is engineered in such a way as to make some people to be perpetually poor. No matter how hard they work, no matter how many resources they've got, they will remain poor, and others would be rich. That is slavery. And for Francophone Africa, it was even worse. You know, when they were getting the so-called independence, they were made to sign a certain number of issues. One, a document which they call the document for the continuation of colonialism. They were made to sign that they're going to deposit 85% of their foreign earnings into the French treasury. And if for some reason they needed some certain small part of their money, they would have to first present a report to the French Minister of Finance to convince him that they require their money. And then a small part of that money will be given to them as a loan on market figures, market rates of interest. If you've never heard that somebody is borrowing his own money on loan, well, you've heard it. That used to happen between Francophone African countries and France. That is purely economic and financial slavery. Every mineral which is found in those Francophone countries must only be proposed to France. They should propose to someone else only if France is not interested. They are forced to only to have French as their official language, which is in this linguistic slavery. Because by forcing people to speak something which is not their mother tongue, you make them to become second citizens, and they become perpetual imitation human beings, trying to imitate the colonialists. That is linguistic slavery, which is incorporated into the financial and economic slavery. They had to train their army, meaning that they cannot have any military secrets against the French colonialists. That is military slavery. So, this had went on until a few countries are now saying enough is enough. And France is not even willing to let go. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, they're not willing to let go. They've been so used to easy money. They used to earn, just because we're using the CFA franc, that used to bring into France 440 billion euros every year into the French treasury. And here they say Africa is poor. You have emotional slavery. That is using artifacts, electromagnetic antennas, chemicals which are put in water and so on, chemtrails which are spread in the air, and some pharmaceutical products and certain types of political system to create negative emotions where people are not happy. They are always having negative emotions because some beings actually feed from that. But not only that, with negative emotions, they are not able to actually manifest and create what it is they want, because the negative emotion brings us into a very low vibratory state. And that was done deliberately. Putting chemicals in water, which they drink, using electromagnetic waves from telecommunication towers, using certain types of programs in the media which accentuate fear and jealousy, using pharmaceuticals which are deleterious for the human body, and certain types of political systems and so on. All of that created emotional slavery. Then you have psychological slavery. Psychological slavery is when you're made to accept your inferiority. You're made to accept that you are inferior. And to do that, they don't hesitate to use anything. For example, they reinterpret, in this particular, in one instance, the Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa reinterpreted certain passages of the book of Genesis, where the prophet Noah, well, that is not the real prophet Noah, because their narrative of prophet Noah is different from the narrative of prophet Noah we know. Nevertheless, it is in their book. They say he drank and was drunk, and he had children, among whom was someone called Ham, the father of Canaan. Canaan was the grandson. So, because of the drunkenness, the clothes fell off his body without him knowing. And allegedly, all the children went and took some sheet of cloth and came walking backward to throw on their father's naked body so as to cover his nakedness. But Canaan was instead laughing at the father. And so when the father got up and was told what had happened, he decided to curse Canaan and said he would forever be a slave to his brothers. All the Dutch Reformed Church had to do then was to say that Canaan was of dark skin. He was a black man. And they used that to mean that that is why he was the ancestor of the black people. That is why black people are having so much trouble all over the world. And they succeeded in convincing a large number of South African blacks to accept that their unfavorable economic conditions, unfavorable social conditions, unfavorable political conditions, and so on, unfavorable health conditions was due to a curse which was put on their ancestor. This is psychological slavery. Meanwhile, all the kinds of atrocities were being done on them, including spreading AIDS by SIMAS, a certain South African secret intelligence agency. So, psychological slavery is also introduced by deforming our history, removing all our heroes. There's a certain Congolese, for example, they give an impression that God is a white man. But when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends a certain Simeon Kimbangu in Congo, who could also make dua and a dead person come back to life, those born blind could see, the Belgians were very quick to kill him, because that is a very bad example. If they're trying to show that Jesus Christ, a white man, could do that because he's God the Son, it's very bad for the psychological domination to see a black man doing the same thing. So they had to kill Simeon Kimbangu in order to maintain the psychological domination of the black race. We were the original race all over planet Earth. They've managed to wipe that out of history. So, they use desires, they accentuate our fears, they use social conditioning in such a way that we begin to expect from others. In other words, we don't do anything until others say, good, you can do it. They have to approve everything of ours. Whenever something happens in Africa, you find African leaders running to Europe. That is part of the psychological slavery. All their fantasies and desires depend on the other person. And we tend to have goals which are conditioned by what the other person or the enslavers claim is good for us, not necessarily what is in our best interest, because of psychological slavery. Now, the language itself is manipulated to introduce inferiority complex. When somebody disturbs you on the phone, what do? You put him on the blacklist. When you say somebody's heart is as black as charcoal, what does it mean? He's a bad man. Now, how can you say somebody is a bad man because his heart is black? and at the same time you say my skin is black, I'm a good man. Now you understand why many of our daughters are trying to use cosmetics to remove the melanin from their skin in order to become light in complexion. Because that black skin has been driven down into their heads to be a curse. Our natural tough hair is being changed with the chemicals in order to make it to be straight hair rather than curly. All of that is psychological slavery. Not to talk of linguistic slavery, which is another category, where you're forced to speak someone else's language. In other words, you become an eternal apprentice, because that language can never be yours. And that is done in order to introduce feelings of superiority. The Europeans have done it, the Arabs have done it, to create superiority complex and give inferiority on the part of the black African. Then you have cultural slavery, where all our own things are considered primitive and diabolical. Our customs, our culture, our dances, our political system, the kind of economic system we had, in some cases did not even involve money. All of that was put aside as primitive. We had to adopt the new system, which is capitalist, dog-eat-dog type of system. The collective living we had in our clans and families was put aside, leading to people who don't seem to actually understand the limits of this system, and they start embezzling right and left, leading to what you understand in Africa. Then you had religious slavery, where through religion, other people's mentality, other people's culture, other people's language, other people's values were put onto us. I'm not saying that adopting a religion from somewhere is in itself bad, no. As long as you had the free will of seeing the good in that religion, getting it, and integrating that with what is good in your culture, because there's no culture in this world which is all bad, to come out with a version of that religion which maintains your identity, which holds and preserves your identity and your dignity. Not to have a system where you're trying to become the imitation of someone else, which is what is now happening in Africa. Most Africans, they want to become like Americans, and they can only be imitation Americans or British people, or imitation Arabs. No one is trying to be authentically African, because that has been diabolized and minimized in their eyes. That is religious slavery. And that has been used, especially in the Christian world, to extremes, where a certain pastor could have the audacity to tell his congregation to go outside and eat grass on force like goats. If that is not slavery, tell me what is. Another pastor washed himself in a drum in church, and people were fighting for that water because it was supposed to be blessed. Another pastor stood on stage and called people to come and go on all fours. My sheep, come to me. And apparently in that church they were all women, going on all fours. Another one had people lie down and he had to walk on them because he was supposed to be so pure that touching the bare ground would contaminate him. All these forms of slavery are happening and are being done with religion. So religion is one of the tools of enslavement. But religion is also a tool of salvation. It all depends on how it is used. وَمِن كُلِّ شَيْءٍ خَلَقْنَا زَوْجَيْنِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says everything He created has got two facets, two sides of it. You can use one side or the other. Now, what are the instruments? We've given the various types of slavery: physical slavery, psychological slavery, economic and financial slavery, emotional slavery, cultural slavery, linguistic slavery, religious slavery, chemical and biological or pharmaceutical slavery, and so on. So what are the tools which are used to influence and make people into slavery? The first one is the government, which is put on you people, and the media, including the educational system. People are indoctrinated by those three methods. The government influence, which influence what direction things in the state will go. The media narrative, the media always sets the barrier, sets the mark, the equilibrium point, what is good and what is bad. You see, a certain survey was done on a human being, and it was discovered that if you hear the same thing from 8 different sources, the average person, if you hear the same thing from 8 different sources, it becomes the absolute truth to you. And now we have 5 or 6 media companies which control the narrative of all media in the world. So tell me, is there free press? No. And we need to consider the things like Operation Mockingbird, where the CIA infiltrated almost all the media organizations in the world in order to influence the narrative. You can see that the media is a good tool of enslavement. A doctoral student in Libya was doing research on the influence of education on the population. And in his study, he discovered that the books which were being used in primary schools in Afghanistan were being produced by Princeton University or some other university in America. And there they were using the education to create terrorists, because they wanted to make the Russian occupation of Afghanistan to be hell on earth. Even a book of arithmetic, which shows students how to calculate. The kind of question they were asking the Afghan children was, an American soldier or a Mujahideen soldier using an F-16 American gun, which has so many bullets, if he should fire on a Russian soldier and kill so many, each soldier being killed by 1 bullet, how many bullets are left in the gun? Now that is arithmetic for you. And that kind of arithmetic is arithmetic to generate terrorists. And how did that happen? Because they left the education to be decided by Princeton University. So education itself is a method of introducing slavery. Then you have the media, the type of films you watch. Some 50 years ago, homosexuality was abhorrent, was abominable. But because they've used the films to continuously propagate, promote, now we're having what we're having in a society. Homosexuality is almost being pushed as something normal. Meanwhile, it's just one of the methods they want to use to control the propagation of population of Africa. Africa is the least populated continent if you consider the number of people per kilometer. But for some reason, those guys don't want us because, well, I can understand. In the 16th century or the 14th century, there were 400 million Europeans and 120 million Africans. Because of that, they could colonize us, catch us as slaves and take everywhere. And now in 2023, you have nearly 1.4 billion Africans and you still have 400 million Europeans. So it's not difficult to see that if the trend continues, we are going to be the ones to colonize Europe. And they have to stop that from happening. And one of the ways is to use education and the media, deform facts, change information, falsify history, and so on and so forth. So one of the tools which are used is the government, the media, and the educational system. The second method which is used to introduce slavery is war, induced disease, destructive medical treatments, chemtrails, consumer products that are used to control people physically. War is when you want to come up with a system which doesn't satisfy some people's domination. Like Gaddafi, who wanted to bring gold dinar. That doesn't satisfy them. But they couldn't just say to Gaddafi, stop. So they created some, manipulated, used war to get them into slavery. And it destroyed Libya up to today. You have another case in Nigeria, where Gaddafi had ordered a certain survey to be done by a certain German company. And it surveyed all of Nigeria, and amongst many things, it found that in the northeast section of Maiduguri were certain very precious natural gemstones, natural resources. So the Gaddafi asked the general manager of this German company to come to Libya and asked the Nigerian government to send somebody to come and check. So they sent a certain Major Hamza al-Mustafa to go there. And this German company said, in the northeast of Nigeria, you have more than enough to make Nigeria better than Dubai. Actually, what you have there is something called rhodium, a precious metal, which costs $130 a gram. That's nearly 80,000 a gram. And now, when he came back with the information, what do you think happened? Did they suddenly make a mining section there, mine this thing, and then help all of the country? No. Somebody, when they discovered this immediately, they created Boko Haram. And now it is Boko Haram which is controlling this area. Even the Nigerian army cannot go there. But many European and American NGOs are very busy helping the refugees. And of course, if somebody had a kilogram of rhodium in his pocket while going out, that's already 80 million he's taking out of the place. This is manipulation using war to enslave the population. The population are enslaved because they're in poverty. They cannot do anything. They don't even know anything about rhodium. The kind of level of education they are made to have does not permit them to know what is happening. That is slavery, using war. They also use induced disease. Remember that AIDS spread in Africa in places where certain vaccines were done? Remember how in Kenya the Catholic Church discovered that millions of Kenyan girls were being sterilized with vaccination? Amongst many other catastrophes, that is using induced disease to bring slavery, and as well as deleterious medical treatment, chemtrails, and consumer products have certain toxins put into them in order to dumb down the population. I have explained that chronotoxins were the things used to create this so-called pandemic, which you now saw all over the world. And these chronotoxins had been publicized since 2012 by the World Economic Forum on its website. Remember the law of free will. Before they do it to us, they first tell us. So, war, induced disease, destructive medical treatment, chemtrails, and consumer products which are poison are all used to enslave us physically. The government, the media, and the educational system, they enslave us mentally. And fear is a tool which is used to enslave us emotionally. They make us to have fear of death, fear of disease, fear of poverty, fear of hell, fear of everything, fear, and they make movies, horror movies and so on, to make us to develop the faculty of fear. You know, emotions are like muscles. The more you flex them, the stronger they become. By giving films which show a lot of fears in scenes and so on, and suspense, it makes the particular emotion of fear to be developed, because that they can use to manipulate and enslave us. Spiritual level control, which integrates all of the above, is done using religion. I've already given you many other examples of pastors who did different things to show how slavery can be a reality, even in our modern day Africa. An example of pollutants which are put in things we consume. You have MSG, monosodium glutamate, which is put in certain stock cubes which we consume. This particular product destroys the nerve cells in our brain. It has the risk of causing cancer. It causes headaches and nausea, difficulty breathing, and weaknesses, including sexual weakness. This particular chemical, monosodium glutamate, is found in a majority of stock cubes. In some parts of West Africa, it is used to castrate sheep and cattle. And in Central Africa, some of our daughters inject it into their buttocks in order to make it to protrude backward. Because again, in the capitalist system, they were made to believe that their success in life depends on their body being desirable by the opposite sex. So if it doesn't come naturally, then they inject in order to protrude the buttocks backward. In some cases, it doesn't go down well, and pores and abscesses and things are created inside the buttocks. The tools of manipulation which are used to manipulate the population, because enslave, yes, but after enslave you have to manipulate now to make sure the slavery continues. You have the educational system where brainwashing is used to indoctrinate people into knowledge which will only serve others and not themselves. The medical profession is deformed so that big pharma is the main enslaver, and all the other actors are there to enrich the big pharma. All indigenous knowledge of plants and tree barks and nuts and seeds and so on, flowers, are all suppressed, some of it stolen and converted into patentable molecules which can be patented to make money. The political system is introduced which has nothing to do with African culture or African history. So Africans can make heads or tail of anything. They say democracy, because they are the ones who print money. The Africans cannot print money. And so they can always print money and make the candidate they want to win any particular election. That is a manipulation for enslavement. You have military force. They always prevent the people from producing their own weapons. And the slaves also play the game. I remember a young man saw on television, a young man who succeeded in his welding workshop to produce a pistol which could have 12 rounds. Instead of the state going to this young man and say, son, we're spending millions importing this thing from outside. If we want you to produce like this and supply our police, how can it go? They were very quick to catch this young man and put in prison. How do we reason? If those who in Europe were doing like that, we will not find any weapons there to buy. People are so attached to power that the least thing which happens, they only think of their power. Recently, a young man was able to manipulate to show that water can be used as a fuel in cars. And very quickly they caught him, a certain Rodrigue Aisi. They caught him and put in jail. With difficulty, he succeeded in proving to the people that he had no evil intent and came out. Instead of supporting him. You have military force which is used, and the military-industrial complex suppresses people. You have the religion which is used to sheepify the population and create intermediaries between you and your creator. That's one way they reduce you to slavery. They cut the contact between you and your creator and put somebody in between. You have to talk to that person for him to talk to the creator. That person can either be a white man, thereby deifying the whole white race, or the intermediary could be a certain language which will not be your language, with somebody else's language. That already gives you an inferior position. Up till today, in India, some people still think that Krishna only understands the Sanskrit language. And they are willing to pay thousands of dollars to gurus to ask certain prayers to Krishna for them. That is real slavery. Sometimes it's not the language, but certain saints are put, send this or send that. Or sometimes you find even some Muslims who are astray going to the graves of certain so-called wali, saints, Muslim saints, because those ones can intercede. That is the strategy of slavery. They use the financial and banking system to make sure that people remain slaves. Then you have cultural dictatorship, where your own culture is diabolized and only the foreign culture is considered to be good. You have linguistic oppression, where your language, you know how they call our languages vernacular. When it's like African language, it's not a language, it's a vernacular. But when it's a European language like Spanish, Portuguese, oh, that's a language. That's already slavery. Then you have racial brainwashing, where certain races are considered to be more advanced than others. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects us to free this slavery from within so that it can be freed from without. In Surah 30 verse 4, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us that corruption has appeared on earth due to what people have done. So Allah can make them to taste the fruits of their own hands. Let us not condone to slavery. Take your power. Free yourselves from all the forms of slavery. Your reality, our reality, depends on your emotions which you have within you, your perceptions, your thoughts, your beliefs, your desires, your past experiences, your future experiences, as well as the orientation and special mission of your spiritual body or your consciousness, and who you collaborate with outside yourself, as well as, of course, your attachment to the one and almighty Creator. If we do not liberate ourselves from slavery, what will be the consequences? How will you know that? Well, if we decide to still continue to be slaves, then we'll continue to have poverty, both spiritual, emotional, material, intellectual, psychological, etc. We will continue to be self-minimizing, that is, lacking confidence in ourselves and our abilities. We will continue to be restless. We will continue to be disconnected with the rest of the world, manifesting confusion and uncertainty. We will continue to criticize ourselves. Look, all the African leaders, African population, always criticizing their leader, or that minister has stolen money, that one has gone up, that one has come down, because they don't think that they can do anything. They are expecting someone from outside to come and do it. A certain great leader called Vladimir Putin, he said something about us Africans. He said, when an African becomes rich, his bank accounts are in Switzerland. He cures himself in France. He invests his money in Germany. He buys his goods in Dubai. He consumes Chinese. He prays in Mecca or Rome. His children study in Europe, USA or Canada. His tourism is in the European Union, USA, Canada, etc. And when he dies, he is buried in Africa. Africa is only a cemetery for Africans. How can one develop a cemetery? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala facilitate our liberation from slavery. Let us make an effort. Like the young president of Burkina Faso said, a slave who is not willing to strive for his own liberation does not deserve pity from anybody. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. We thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who has given us a religion which gives us all the tools we need to free ourselves from slavery. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.